Cool. All right. So I'm
Oh
just going
yeah.
to share my screen. So just confirm that you can see this.
Yeah.
Cool. And then confirm that you can hear this. Hearing okay.
Yeah.
Cool. So yeah, so I'm going to start with this one. I had mentioned this to Grant super briefly. But essentially I'm going to start with a mix that I consider like dead simple in terms of like you can see how many tracks are on the side. It's like 25 tracks, if that. It's like basically the tiniest a mix could be really. Because one of the things I want to talk about is competition, which it has a sort of multitudinous meaning in the way we're going to talk about it. Mostly, and in the like the dynamics compression way, in terms of like mixing is really about focusing the intended imaginary listener's intention. So like when you're working with dynamics or mixing, you're basically saying like, here's what to pay attention to, here's what to not actively think about, but like hear and feel versus like notice what's being spotlit. And also we're going to definitely talk or at least touch on like mastering levels and like LUFS and stuff like that in terms of just like a really loud, consistent sound and how like it's kind of genre specific, but how like it gets even more important all the things you do with EQ and mix when everything is just kind of slammed to this level where you really aren't getting a huge dynamic difference between sections of the song. It matters, I would say, even more how you treat everything, and then also just like having a really critical comparative view that when we mix or master something in a genre, we know how it's stacking up against things in those genre that translate really well. And translate meaning just like exist in a pot, like basically you get a good reproduction of the song in different spaces. Like a song's never going to sound identical on a phone as it does on like a big hi-fi or it does in your car, but the idea is like none of those should be unnecessarily place where the song falls apart. So like for instance, what's that Dua Lipa song that is like a literal billion listens, like Don't Stop Now. Like the verse of that song is just drums and bass and a vocal. So like if you listen to it on a phone and you couldn't hear the kick drum and you couldn't hear the bass and all you could hear was snare and hat and vocal, like that mix would be really really bad because it's a giant pop mix that's going to play in like Target ads, right? Like and stuff on YouTube. Like you don't want that to fall apart on the phone. So if you listen to that song, you can tell like they've made a very intentional effort that the bass actually has a ton of mid-range content. So even if you don't have, 200 hertz and below, the mix doesn't fall apart. So that's sort of what I'm talking about in terms of translation, meaning like what are the standards of both, loudness, dynamics, frequency response, width, all of these things. What are the standards for the genre that you're working in, regardless of what that genre is, being able to compare accurately? Because I think most people's worst moment when they start mixing is when they do the reference test of like, oh, here's a mix I love that I've listened to 10 years that I think is like the greatest sounding thing out there. It sounds great in every system. And let me play my mix back and forth with it. That is one of like the worst feelings when you think you have a good mix and then it's just like totally falling apart in reference. So we'll talk sort of about how to approach that. So we think we might kind of go backwards in terms of like big picture zooming down into little picture. So we're definitely going to talk about, like some of the very practical approach points of like how to approach compression or how to approach EQ and things like that. But I think we'll start from like a bigger zoomed out picture and just in terms of thinking of like how does a track function within its given genre, within its given, like the things that it's going to be played on, or even like how is it going to compete on something like, Tidal or Spotify that has loudness normalization. So I picked this one first because it's very, very simple. It's very, very short, but it's very, very competitive and loud, meaning that like basically for how short and punchy it is, like it's all supposed to be big and loud and important at once, and how the management of that is a little bit tricky. And then we'll look at something that's a little bit more dynamic, has more of like a dynamic arc where some things are allowed to be quieter. There's allowed to be, well, I'm sure we'll talk about tension and release, and virtually everything has this in terms of like the frequency content. Like if you want to make the frequency content feel like there's so much information, frequency content meaning like the lowest low sounds, the highest high sounds, like taking away a lot of low end right before a chorus drops is going to make that chorus feel way bigger, or taking away all the high end before the vocal comes in is going to make the vocal feel brighter and bigger. So just stuff like that in terms of expansion and release, tension and release. We'll definitely talk about that. So I picked this because it's kind of the least subtle version of all of these things, and then we'll slowly back up to something more subtle. So let's just start by listening to this, and then this will kind of go, like I said, macro to micro. Start thinking about how a song, even if it's like fully mixed, figuring out how well it sits within its given genre expectations, and then we'll like use that information to inform us as we go to like the more individualized things. Because at the end of the day, why I think this is important is because you kind of need to have the final product in mind whenever you place a mic you know, whenever you record a performance, whenever you make an EQ or compression move, if you don't have some final vision or you don't have a sound or expectation in your head of where you're trying to get to, you kind of don't have a way to succeed unless you can have some critical information to compare it against to say like, how am I doing based on, you know, 15 years of the songs that I love that are in this genre. That's important, but then also using that information from the get-go to say like, I know I'm going to put my kick mic here because I know, you know, 2 months from now when I'm mixing, I'm going to want this type of sound out of the kick. So I'm not going to put the kick mic, you know, 2 feet in front of it. I'm going to put it 6 inches inside of it. So stuff like that. I think you kind of have to have the big picture before you can make those decisions really accurately. So we'll kind of go about it from that slightly conceptual framework. All right, and if this is not your genre, that's totally fine. The things we're talking about are not specific to genre. The only thing that's important is that the things we're using to compare and get critical information are genre specific. But like, if this was a pop song, we would be listening to like Taylor Swift and Dua Lipa for our references instead of the stuff in this genre. So it doesn't really matter what genre you're talking about. The same approach works for everything. We're just using this as example. The next thing will be a slightly less aggressive if this is not your jam. So this is only like a minute long. So let's just listen through. And I would encourage you, like, we'll talk about a lot of metering things. First listen, just listen with your ears and not your eyes. We'll talk about the difference of that in terms of the mixing perspective, which is actually very important. But let's just get a feel for what it is. It's about a minute through, and it's just kind of trying to be everything all at once. And we'll talk about how to manage that. Oh, I don't know if I mentioned, if you haven't enabled stereo on your individual accounts, if you go to your settings, you can enable that. It'll just help on your end. I think the replay won't be stereo either way, but it is set up on my end to go stereo. So if you can listen in stereo, that is definitely for the best. So check your settings that you're enabling your ability to listen to it stereo. I'm just going to confirm something real quick, that I'm enabling my original sound. And just confirm again. Sorry, I got it on my smart tool. Just confirm again that you're getting playback. Yep, cool. All right, so from the top, minute through, confirm that you're listening in stereo as we go. Cool. So that's the mix. So it's big and loud, right? And its goal is to be big and loud and aggressive. So it's kind of important to talk about why any of this stuff matters. So when I was talking about competition earlier, this is like, why do we need to make, you know, like our vocal sound or our snare? Why do we need to EQ and compress it? Like, why does it matter? And I will argue that it matters less and less the less competitive either the genre or the style of song is. Like, think about a jazz quartet, right? It's like typically a bunch of low volume acoustic instruments, people playing in a room that they kind of determine their own mix. Like, you know, the saying, like, a really good live band will mix themselves. They'll know when to pull back in volume. They'll know when to be louder, to step out. So something like that is very, you really wouldn't need a lot of EQ and compression because you're kind of getting everything you need. The instrumentation of the group and the dynamics is kind of controlled by the group itself, right? But then you get something like this where everything is very loud, very compressed, tons of frequencies on basically every instrument. It becomes a lot more important and a lot more critical that everything is kind of treated in a way that serves the end goal. So the end goal is basically saying, like, whatever the intention of the song is, whether it's, you know, to make you dance or to like make you bummed out or to like get your blood boiling, that all of the things you do technically should go into serving that. So it's hard to say that, like, you're serving a really good pop dance song if you can't feel the kick and snare, right? Like those are technical things, but they have a very emotional end result, which is like, I don't like the song and I don't want to dance to it because of these technical deficiencies. So we're going to talk about a lot of technical stuff, but just keeping in mind that it's all in the end result of like making the song work better or feeding into what the song is trying to accomplish, using the technical stuff to do that. The technical stuff isn't more important than that. The technical stuff exists for that reason, right? To serve the song. So when we look at the song and we think about essentially what the song is trying to do, right? It's big and loud. So I will actually like touch on just something Grant said that I think is just important to get your head around. So like if we listen to the guitars and bass together, so these are just like the rhythm guitars. So I'm going to talk briefly about just an EQ idea in general, just to get our ears around EQ. Then we'll talk about it in a broader like full song sentiment. But right now, so let's just listen to, these are the main guitars. So just hard left and right, doubled guitars, and the bass. So that's just a little by themselves. Here's in the whole mix. So this is, Grant sort of mentioned this kind of specifically, which is why I want to touch on it. Like, so one of the things we talk about a lot, or is at least talked about a lot in the mixing world, is like the reference of what you're mixing to when you're mixing it. Basically sort of meaning, like if you're mixing the snare, are you going to listen to the snare in isolation, do all of your mix changes, put it back in the mix and move on? You could, but really it doesn't matter what the snare sounds like by itself. Like there's literally no way to know what the snare sounds like by itself, because no one who's listening to it is ever going to hear the snare in isolation. They're going to hear the snare in competition with, you know, the kick and the hat and the toms and vocals and guitars and everything else. So when it comes to that, something like these guitars, if we look at what's going on in these guitars, you might argue, listening in isolation, that these guitars do not have nearly enough low end. And you would probably be right, because listening to them by themselves, they don't sound like they have enough low end. But listening to them with the bass, clearly that low end is just coming from somewhere else. So it's one of those things where, like in isolation, if you were mixing these guitars by themselves and you made the guitars sound amazing by themselves, it would actually be super problematic in this mix, because, you know, you have the bass in the low end, you have 2 floor toms and a rack tom, you have a kick, you have sub drops and a bunch of other stuff going on. So like I will argue that if I let all this bass end back in and the guitars sound more full by themselves, they'll actually sound worse with the bass. So I'll just basically, I'm taking this filter in and out. All this first stage is doing is just a little filtering on the top end for like fizz and hiss and things, and then a big sweeping low end cut. So now with the bass. It's pretty minor, but the guitars definitely, even just with one other instrument competing with them, this isn't the whole mix even yet, but even then the guitars become muddier and less defined when they're fighting with the bass for the low end frequency. So that's just the type of thing we're talking about. So when we talk about the whole mix as a whole, we're thinking about like what is the EQ on the entire mix. It's with the idea that we've already done pretty much everything we can to make these minor things already as good as we can, and then we'll zoom out and come back to this type of stuff. But that, I would say that's something that's very typically common. If you know that there's a bunch of information in the low end, these guitars aren't allowed to have that much low end information, because while those sound great in isolation, them fighting for other things in the mix for that low end build up is not going to be helpful. And especially thinking of our zoomed out view, if we get an idea, or if we like are about to gain our reference on how much low end a mix like this, or an aggressive heavy mix, usually has, there's a lot of information that we could hypothetically know going into this that would dissuade us from having a huge low end boost at the bottom end of the guitars. So we're gonna pop into Ozone for a little bit here. So Ozone, basically my entire master chain is just going to be inside of Ozone, and I have something here, we'll ignore it and then we'll come back to it. But essentially Ozone, it's as if you had, you know, like basically, you know, the first 10 plugins, but we'll just do it all inside of one plugin instead of 10 separate plugins. But these are all processes that you would imagine that you would hit on. when you're thinking about a mix all as one thing. So here's the thing that's important that we're going to touch on here that's going to come back over and over again is the idea of outside reference, and that there is not necessarily an objective truth to like this is how your mixtures sound, but there is like a common consensus about like over the last 20 years pro mixes in this genre have these characteristics. And if you are either actively avoiding and ignoring those, or if you're unintentionally unaware missing all of those markers, your mix is guaranteed to someone who spent 20 years listening to the best productions of the genre. If your mix has no clue what those standards are, the person that's hearing that is going to either subconsciously or very consciously be evaluating it compared to every other pop record, every other rock record, every other metal record they've ever heard, and they're going to establish basically whether or not the production works based on that. So it's important that we have that critical information as well, because in the same way that no one's ever going to listen to your snare in isolation, no one's ever going to hear your mix in the isolation of listening to it in your room with your ears, right? Like, you need to make sure that you're doing everything you can so it sounds great, knowing that there's this huge amount of other music out there in the same genre that has influenced it that it's going to be stacked up against. So I'm essentially, first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to set up my master chain. So essentially, I have a master track already, and we don't need to go super in depth with this, but essentially I'm just creating one stage between my my master track and all the things that come before it. So I'm just selecting everything that has the output of output 1 and 2, which is my main output, which is everything except for stuff in that sum. And I'm just going to, that stuff doesn't matter, but sure. And I'm just going to create a quick submaster. Great. So hypothetically, if I mute this submaster, every sound should stop because every sound is filtering through it. Great, cool. So now the submaster is the final control over everything, which is great. So I'm just going to create one more stage, and then we'll have our entire master routing. So I'll explain this all in 1 second. Cool. And I'm glad that you're recording this, because this is a great thing. If like, I'm sure a lot of this, it's going to be just 2 hours of information. So we can definitely slow down, we can go different directions. But yeah, it'll be good that if you want to just reference back at this at some point, if some of it goes too fast, totally fine. I'm just trying to like cast a pretty broad net. So essentially what I've done here, and you can see this in the routing, is every track, instead of going to main stereo, is instead going to a bus called submaster. And submaster is the aux track that's receiving it. Cool. So we can see it as that input. But what I'm basically using here, I'm using 2 master tracks. So this one at the end, I'm never going to do anything to its volume. It's just going to live exactly where it is, and it's just going to be how we meter everything out that we want to see. So I'm not even going to have any of the processing on it. So this is just going to live at 0, and this is going to be the final stage that tells us, like, how loud are we clipping, anything like that. Submaster, this is going to be where all the processing is. If I need to do any fade-ins, fade-outs, I'll do it there. Transport, basically the way this works and the way the behavior of a master track in Pro Tools works as opposed to, say, an audio or an aux track is that you'll notice if I lower the volume on this aux track, you'll notice this here, which is the information feeding into my master plugins, doesn't change. Right? So we can't hear it, but that information is still there, right? So the different behavior that master track has is instead of just lowering the output, so in this case, as we heard, we lowered the output down to 0, but the information hitting the front end of my plugin, you know, which is going to have all of my dynamic stuff, right? That's going to be where all my thresholds are for, does it have compression or limiting or anything like that. None of that changes. So, but what happens differently with a master track, you'll notice when I lower this, the information in the track itself is going to be lower. Right, so you can see now that we have like way more headroom in that track than we did before. So this is useful, period, because say we were clipping by like 1 decibel, the whole mix was just clipping a little bit, I could just move this down a couple dB, create more headroom, and we would no longer be clipping. If I did that here and we were clipping and I lowered it, it would still be clipping, and now it's just quieter afterwards. So that's kind of an important distinction, whether we're creating headroom before the clipping or, you know, headroom happens in general. I can create more headroom for any reason, and we'll talk about micro macro dynamics with this, versus just like, oh, the thing is already clipped and now I'm lowering the volume. So essentially I'm just going to do some metering here. So yeah, if you thought this was going to be all a thrill ride, it's not. We're also just going to sit around and do some metering, because basically I just want to know really carefully, oh, what am I looking for? There you are. I just really want to know really carefully how much headroom do I have feeding in here, knowing that my transport can create more headroom. So essentially, I don't need a ton of headroom. Like there's a bunch of rules and stuff. If you look at any mix workshop or anything online, they just try to tell you a bunch of rules about like you need this much headroom, like you should have this much dB when you compress. You should never boost, your presence more than point whatever dB. It's all really silly. Essentially, I just want to make sure I have enough to work with. So what I'm looking at here is both of my peak level. So you'll see that there's like a true peak level and there's just a general peak level. This is probably a good time to talk about RMS and LUFS. Particularly LUFS. RMS is kind of the old way of looking at this, but essentially when we're talking about loudness, there's a couple different things we're talking about, right? So we have peak loudness, which basically says like if you have a snare transient, you're going to see a giant peak that's going to last like 10 milliseconds, something super, super short, and then you're going to have a big long decay. There's going to be like a release, and then there's going to be like finally down to silence, right? So even though that will meter at like say -1, we only hear -1 for a split second. So if you take a 1 second period of audio and there's one snare transient, a peak meter would say, oh, that's at -1, but something that's evaluating not just the peak volume, but the actual loudness, like how we perceive it over time, it's going to be way quieter than -1, because we heard -1 for a split second, and then maybe we heard -10 and -15 and -20. So what LUFS is reading over a period of time is really just what is the integrated loudness, meaning what is the loudness as our human ears hear it, because it also has something, God, this really jumped to being a little too advanced. It has something to do with the Fletcher-Munson curve. Does anybody know what the Fletcher-Munson curve is? Who wants to jump in?
That describes the human range of hearing,
Yes,
right?
it does. Tell us all about it, Michael.
Um, I believe that higher frequencies are perceived as a little bit louder, and also lower frequencies are either a little louder or softer. I can't remember.
Software, yeah. And actually, Grant, do me a favor, just find a Fletcher-Munson curve image and just dump it in the chat so people can look at this. But yeah, essentially, and that's really important because what we're talking about, and I know I'm coming at this kind of a backwards way, but what we're thinking about is the final end product deliverable. So we have to have some understanding of like how loudness works, how our frequency distribution works, and we have to know a little bit of how that is, because if you think about the human ear, and this is true for all humans, this is just how hearing works. Like Michael said, we don't hear every frequency at evenly. It doesn't strike us as evenly. So if you were to play every frequency from 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz, and you were to meter at them so they were at an identical level for each individual frequency, the human ear would not hear them all at equal volume, right? The really low frequencies, just because we can hear 100 hertz doesn't mean we can hear it as well as we can hear 1K, right? And this is for everybody across the board. It's a little different for each person, but there's going to be some of this curve. Basically less on the low end, more on the high end in terms of what we can hear better. So knowing that, when we look at our frequency distribution and we want something that sounds flat, we should expect that the low end volume is going to be louder than the mids, and the mids are going to be louder than the highs, because that's the inverse of what we're bad at hearing, right? We're worse at hearing lows. So if we want to hear that the low end is even with the mid range, we should expect that the low end is going to be louder than the mid range, and the mid range is going to be louder than the high range. That's going to mean that it is closer to flat than if we made it flat. It would sound very bright and tinny and kind of harsh and would have very little low end to balance it out. So Fletcher-Munson curve, just knowing things like that, essentially the reason why it's important here, LUFS, loudness units at full scale integrated, basically takes that into account. So for instance, if your low end is metering at -1, it knows that the human ear isn't going to hear that the same as if 1K was metering at -1, right? So it adjusts for that. It basically says how humans hear, Fletcher-Munson curve, over time, what is that value? So basically, if I wanted to get the LUFS of this whole piece, I'd have to play it through top to bottom to get that value. But just some general ranges, like for instance, -14 LUFS is, I won't say quiet, because I mean, over the years, our ideas of what is loud or what is quiet, but basically, if you make a mix quieter than -14 LUFS, which is, the integrated value over time, basically, people, companies like Spotify, distributors, will manually limit it with an algorithm just to make it loud enough to be on their service. And if it's way, way, way louder than that, they'll turn it down. So basically, what I was saying about loudness normalization, when you listen to Spotify, you don't want to hear your friend's mix, 12 dBs quieter than like the loudest trap mix in the world, right? Like all the EDM dance stuff is like way closer to like -6, -5. The pop stuff's usually -7, -8. It basically evens all of that out. But it's still important to know where that loudness stuff is. So we're essentially just going to look at the peak level, and we'll look at the integrated loudness level, and that will tell us something. Both things will tell us something, but slightly different. So again, peak level, that's just the meter telling us where the top momentary is. Could be a split second, could be sustained. The loudness, integrated units at full scale, LUFS, is going to tell us what it really is over time based on the human ear, not just based on a meter. So let's just listen to a couple seconds. And this is without the limiter. So that's bypass. I'm just also good. So good information. I'm just going to reset it and check the heaviest setting, the loudest piece, just to know where our biggest numbers are going to be. Oh, very interesting. Cool. So that was good. So you saw earlier on, we were getting like -2, -2.5 was our loudest things, like right here. This is our peak level for each individual channel, left and right. And we were getting values that are more like -14 and stuff. This is telling us, okay, there's moments of the piece where it's louder and also where the peak level is significantly louder. So what this is telling me is I'm not going over 0, but I'm touching 0. So basically, it's telling me I should build in some more headroom so that I am not already touching 0 by the time I start trying to make it louder. Cool. So now, and that's definitely the loudest part of it. So now we know even at the loudest part, we have 1.6 decibels of headroom. Most of it we have way more than that. But at least at those moments, we have enough headroom that I can do some dynamics processing, some limiting, some maybe some light, saturation, distortion. I can do that stuff without it already, losing information. And this is also kind of important too. Like, there's nothing inherently wrong with clipping. Like, clipping is kind of a sound of certain genres to have like the drums a little clipped or like the vocals a little clipped. Or if you listen to anything in the last 5 years of like underground dance music, like there's a very blown out quality to it that is actually kind of a thing. The important thing is knowing and choosing when you want that versus just like you're losing information if you just don't set enough headroom. You're just missing pieces of transient that you can't choose. So basically, I've just built in the headroom, so now I can do whatever I want to do without worrying about that. So here I only have 2 things active, so these are things I just threw on as I'm listening. So I'm very much, while I'm mixing, some of these things are already happening. So the thing that would happen no matter what will come back to EQ, but essentially, and I'll explain why, but like for me at least, if you're trying to really get a mix locked in, you can't really do that until you have some idea of the mastering level. So even if we were to like say take off all this loudness and send it to a mastering engineer, we would at least have to know what effect it would have. Because think about a full mix, right? You have some things that are sustained, like you might have a guitar chord that sustains at one even volume the same time, which is kind of the exact opposite of a drum kit, which has these huge dynamic spikes and that immediately come way down, right? So these are 2 very different instruments in terms of how they create loudness, right? Like really big momentary loudness that dies off right away versus a lower level of peak loudness that sustains much more consistently. So for instance, if all our drums are sticking out, 3 decibels louder than everything else, and we turn on a limiter, the first 3 decibels of reduction is only going to affect the drums, right? Everything will be evenly getting louder except for the loudest 3 decibels of drums, which will be getting quieter. So essentially, you can't really mix your drums for the master unless you are hearing what limiting does to it, because these big transient spikes, as long as they're not clipping, are going to be the first things that feed into that. So regardless of how we were doing this, mixing with this on is like kind of necessary for me, at least in genres that are so much about loudness that this is. So here we've made no changes besides just getting louder. And what I'm going to use to decide basically how loud we are is, again, LUFS. What I'm shooting for is something I would say like maybe like between -8 and -10, and we just want to first just check that we're metering that. So here we're totally mixing with our eyes. We know where a standard is and we just want to meet it. Cool, and I'm not going to listen through the whole song, which I would have to. Let's hear the loudest back. Cool. So it has moments that are closer to -8, and then it has moments that are closer to -9, -9.5. We're totally in the ballpark. So the only thing I've changed is the loudness, but we kind of need this to be able to compare to other stuff. So when I'm talking about reference stuff, we've already done everything really in the mix that we can do. We're just looking at the entire song all at once. So basically, what this plugin is on is basically the whole mix, right? The whole mix is running through this fader, and the whole mix is running through this processing. So when we're looking at this and we're looking at changing things to this, we're really looking about how are we affecting the entire mix evenly as opposed to one single track. So when we're looking at the whole mix, we now have to think of ways. There's a multitude of ways that we can change this mix, but to really know how and why we need to do these, we need to have some idea of what we're comparing it to. So this is where reference becomes really, really important. So first, I'm just going to do a one-to-one reference. So this is like an A-B, if you ever hear that term, which I'm sure you have. So basically, I just want to compare the way my mix sounds to the way a mix that I think is a similar genre and style sounds, and I want to hear how they are different from each other and how they are similar to each other. So I can do this really easily just by bringing up a reference track. So you'll notice I've also lowered the gain a little bit. I don't need to be quite as loud as this track. The thing I'm listening for at this point is not loudness. It's just things like level and frequency distribution and all the stuff we're about to talk about. So here, all I really want to hear, I'll actually lower it. I just want to hear the two mixes at an even volume. So like, for instance, if this mix was 10 decibels louder than my mix and I didn't adjust for it, there would be no way to critically tell, like, oh, this one has more bass, this one has less bass, because at 10 decibels louder, you can't really compare apples to apples, right? You're comparing apples to oranges. So here, I just want to compare apples to apples. I just want to hear a mix in a similar genre next to my mix to know where things are different, essentially. So basically, I'm just going to play my mix. I'll play one of the heavy things, the loud things. It's all loud. And then we'll compare it to something that I think is a really good mix from someone else that I think translates really well. I've heard it on a bunch of systems. I think it's really solid, and it's something I'm kind of going for. Cool. So already I can tell some differences, and here I'm using both my ears and my eyes. If you weren't able to tell, basically you can see both mixes on top of each other. So when I press play, the EQ you're going to see is just my mix. Oh, sorry. When I hit reference, you're going to see only the reference mix. When I remove the reference, you're going to see both mixes at once. So the first one you see is the reference. The one that then joins it is my mix next to it. So just the reference. My heart is coming out. So we can see for the most part we're doing okay, but there are some differences for sure. So the next thing I'm going to use to really tell this in depth is I'm going to use another tool, and this tool is called Total Balance Control, which is a really, really amazing tool. So basically, one mix is great. One mix tells me a lot about, like, am I way off the mark? Is this generally within? There'll be some differences no matter what. Like, I'm not going to try and make my mix sound identical. But what I really want, more than just hearing one mix, which is still very useful, is I want to know, say, like 10 to 15 mixes that I think all of them are really great. How does my mix sound next to that? So I'll first show this in a general way, and then we'll go super specific. So what this does, what Tonal Balance Control does, is basically has these profiles of, you know, any genre. So here we'll say... we'll start with rock. So here, it'll say, so this is basically for like the last 20 years, maybe like between 2,000 and 5,000 rock songs. What is the common denominator in terms of the quietest the low end is and the loudest the low end is? And then the quietest the low mids is and the loudest it is. So I'll solo these individually, but essentially what it's showing me is a profile of basically the average of the last 20 years of rock songs, what the cumulative knowledge about those things says to our ears. I want to sit inside each of these, and we'll hear how they're each a little different. So low end, mids, high mids, highs. Cool. So that's pretty good news here. So the information I'm getting from the general rock setting is pretty good. So generally, the main thing I'm seeing is that between like 150 and 1K is a little lacking, but otherwise pretty cool. So to get even closer to what I want, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a target. and I'm going to create the target by basically, I don't know if you can see this screen because I'm no longer in Pro Tools, but basically I have a reference track playlist with 10 to 15 songs, so it's going to look at those right now. So basically I just fed it 10 to 15 songs that are in this genre that I think sound really, really good. And you'll notice that this is much tighter, right? This is not as forgiving as the other one is. It has much tighter standards. And you can see, especially in the high mids and the highs, like there's not a lot of variance between these recordings in terms of the ones that have the most high end versus the least high end. So now I have a much narrower basically a target. Like this is not gospel, but it gives me a really good idea that like if my low mids were way quieter than every recording I think has great low mids, that's a really critical piece of information for me to know while I'm mixing, right? Because otherwise I'm going to play it next to the other ones and be like, wow, why does this sound hollow and bad? So now I'm comparing it to a much more competitive understanding of what I want to accomplish. So now let's listen to it. Cool, so this tells me a lot. First, it tells me that my high end I'm pretty solid on, but I'm kind of riding a little too much on the lows. So this is also why it's important to have some level of opinion. Yeah, we can see I'm not playing anything anymore. So I typically find that these recordings that I do really love and translate really well, one thing that is kind of a Sophie's choice when it comes to low end is like, a huge booming low end does not make for a really tight rhythmic song, right? If you think about like a huge booming 808, it's usually not on like really fast or in this case really technical songs, right? So there's kind of a trade-off there between I want like a big like full bottom end versus I want like a really tight, really controlled bottom end. So I know that I'm cool to maybe be a little bit louder than the mixes I'm comparing it to, but I probably don't want to be quite as loud. So this is already feeding me a lot of information. Let's do another test. I'm going to ride through a more of like a verse section of the song. Cool, so I'd say two big problem areas is like 150 and lower is too loud, and then basically like 2.5 to maybe 6 or 7K is a little weak. So that can just be my starting idea of like, now I know where I want to look so that when I compare my mix to other mixes, I know that it's going to treat a little bit more normally. So we're going to actually ignore the EQ I already created, and we're just going to build one from scratch. And basically, we saw that the low end, the low lows were a little too loud, so I'm just going to start by like giving a little love off of them. And the high ends was good, but I could use just a little bit more there, just get a little bit more brightness. And then the thing I really, really want to address is the lows. So actually, I'm going to use low end focus. So basically, I can just select a range, and I know that I want 150 and lower, like very exactly. So I'm just going to find 150 and lower. Cool. And we can hear what's down there now, right? Like we know that like this isn't the most critical information. Like this is good and important and we need this for balance, but like this information is not make or break to whether or not the song is going to sound like the song, right? Like we can lose a decibel off of this and it's still going to sound like the song. So let's start just by losing a dB. And in terms of the control, I'm going to go a little on the punchy end, which will play up more of the transients and less of the sustain. The smooth side would be the opposite. So I'm going to take it to the whole mix. So again, these things are subtle, and they're meant to be very subtle, but there should be some very minor, maybe even just over time, effect of the low end being a decibel quieter or not. And again, like I said, it's sort of a trade-off between it's going to feel slightly thinner, but a little bit more compact, a little bit more tight in terms of across frequencies, and it's going to translate a little bit better because it's depending less on the presence of this low end to work. So I'm just going to put this in and out, and we'll hear, I'll make it a little more drastic, I'll do twice as much to start, and we'll hear just, so again, don't really think with your eyes, just think you're listening to a song and what is the difference between the two things, right? They might have positive and negative things for both, but there is a difference, and you will respond a little bit differently to how you feel about it because of that. So here's with it in. So that might feel very subtle to me. This feels kind of extreme and drastic. So I'm gonna cut this in half, which is what I was gonna do originally. Because what I'm feeling is when I engage this and we lose a decibel of that end, it feels kind of thin and kind of bottomless. And I can tighten it up a little bit from where it is, but I don't want to go nearly as much as I am. So I'm gonna do the same thing. Basically, when it's engaged like this, it means we're losing a dB. When it's not engaged, we're back to flat, where it's not losing a dB. So we're gonna start flat. Cool. Yeah. So first off, I have the critical information saying that like this is something that is expected of the genre, and now I'm actually using my ears to evaluate, is it doing something good or bad? So -2 was like it's doing a bad thing, it's too thin. -1 is like, okay, it's cleaning up a little bit of like the low rumble and a tiny bit of muddiness, but there's still enough that it feels there, it feels like close to you, but not enough that it feels like tubby and not articulate, which I want. So we can also do some very broader strokes things. So remember I said I think it was about like 3K to 6.5 or 3K to 7. That was a little lacking overall. Let's first find out what's in there. We'll do something broad, and then we'll kind of ignore all of the other information and just start using our ears. So here I'm just trying to match to a profile, and as we do more of this, we're going to get more into I'm just listening for individual things. So here I just want to hear what that range is doing. So again, critical information is good. I can move this fader around and be like, oh cool, but what I really want to do is only hear what's going on in that range. Cool, so this is like 2K to 7. Cool, so it's like a little noisy here, like there's not a lot of tone here, like there's not a lot of pitch of the guitars, it's mostly cymbals and just that high-end presence, brilliance of the vocals is sitting up here. So like I don't want to go crazy on this, I'm already getting a little boost here, but now that I know what's going on there, I'm going to take it way too far, and then I'm going to dial it back. I think a lot of people make the mistake, especially when you're starting out, of like, oh, I'm going to raise 500, and they just raise it a dB, and they're like, I have no idea if that's different. Like, if you're still getting your ears around, like, what does 500 sound like, boost it up by 12 dB, duck it down by 12 dB, you'll be, like, very acutely aware of what's being added and removed, and then you can really do that. So I'm going to start by, you know, like, way increasing it, way dipping it down, and then finding, like, what I think is a good spot for it that is a little boosted, and that'll be much more clear. It'll, like, lock your ears around it, as opposed to if I just take this from flat and just take it up like that, like you're never gonna hear that. Like that's crazy. You kind of need your ear to think about what's going on, to recognize, oh, we're talking about this range in the context of everything, and then you'll be able to hear that even if we're doing a minor change, it does have some small impact, even if it's just like a tiny emotional impact that like would be hard to say like, oh yeah, it feels brighter and punchier because there's more, you know, 5K ish. So I'm gonna start by being crazy with this now in the context of everything, and then we'll dial it in. Cool, and I just ended up, so like you heard really tinny and harsh when it's boosted high, really scooped and ugly. I basically, as I was raising up, I was just waiting for a point where it felt like too much. So we'll do that again. Basically, we'll hear way too much, way too little, go back to unity essentially, and then just start raising it until we feel like we're making it worse instead of better. So they're still too little. Still too little. Starting to be good. Around here gets a little harsh. Cool. So I'm just basically trying to dial in what I'm hearing so that I can balance it out. The real thing I'm hearing here is that I don't feel like I need way more of this. I feel like I need a little bit more of the actual highs. So let's just reference back to our tonal balance control, now having made some of these changes. Cool. Looking a little better. Yeah. Cool, and I can use a little bit more, honestly, I can do a pretty wide one. I would say I could use more of like 3K and up, honestly, in terms of what I'm liking. So I'm going to just take my really wide, it's called a Baxendale, Baxendale shelf. So I'm just going to take this starting around 3K, and I'm just going to maybe go twice as much with it, but I'll do the same thing. I'll dip it way out, bring it way up, and hopefully we'll just hear it reaches a point where it's like, oh, it just sounds a little bit more the way it's supposed to sound in our mind. So having some reference for the genre really helps for this. So let's jump from this to our reference, and then let's set in the highs. My heart is covered in Cool, and we're definitely getting closer there. I can probably dial that back a little bit now that I'm hearing it. I think really what I'm hearing is that this reference one, specifically, and again, I'm balancing one reference against, 10 or 15 in the total balance control, but there's definitely, this one has a really big sort of like forward mid scoop, and then there's kind of a dip in the low mid, so I'm going to kind of try and find and match that. My heart is covered in So the thing I'm going to try to accomplish, I'm going to go way overboard and get something that kind of has a slightly scooped low mids so that I can kind of emulate what that other recording is doing and then basically figure out how much I want. So I'm going to start by making it sound really, really bad. Super scoopy. So if it sounds subtle, it is subtle, but that's kind of the reason. So we're gonna just check a few more things against this one. This is kind of broad. We'll get into more specifics later, but let's just check back from where we started to where we are. And I'm gonna put my low end focus first. So again, we're both gonna check against the reference track we're using, that we're kind of emulating, and against like the whole amount of reference information that we have. A slightly different sound. And kind of what I'm seeing here, I'm noticing my highs are a little bit higher than theirs. I don't need to go quite as extended there, so I can actually change this balance up a little bit. It's a tiny bit harsh, and just get a little bit more of that. And I think so there's totally still differences. Like I definitely have more bass in mine and a tiny bit more high end. Theirs has a bit more of that, a little lower than we were boosting, but definitely like between 1K and 4K is more present, and they have a more distinct dip in the low mids. But overall, when I switch back and forth, it isn't a jarring change of reality from like we're going from one genre to something totally different that feels unrelated. Like they're not sisters, but they're cousins, right? Like they are within the same general idea, even if they are not identical in every way, because we don't want them to be identical, right? Different musicians, different drum kit, different guitars, different tuning, different song, but we do want it to live in that same world so that if someone who's heard that song and has heard a lot of songs like that listens to our song, they're going to understand based on the contextual information of, even just, we're not super close in loudness, but we're not super far, just in terms of general loudness and frequency distribution, that they're like, oh, I know this reads as this to me. And if you're wondering why is this actually important, people still talk about how bad what's that Metallica record, And Justice for All. People still talk about how bad that record sounds because of all of the lack of bass, right? So all that really means is like they're comparing it against every other record that came out around that time period, and even every other Metallica record, and they're saying like, even though I love the songs on this record, the average consumer will tell you that record doesn't have enough bass. Like that is such a length beyond the subtlety that we're talking here, where just like average anybody with no interest in audio can say this record sounds bad because I know it should have more bass because I listen to this style of music, whatever it is. That's the thing you really, really want to avoid, right? Like, and that's a huge band that is. They've actually had a couple albums like that, like between Saint Anger and Justice for All and what's the newer one, Death Magnetic. Like, they have a pretty shoddy history of producing high quality mixes. But anyway, like that's why it's important. People still talk about that, multi-million selling album and how bad they think it sounds because it doesn't stick to the genre conventions of how loud the bass should be. So this is very, very zoomed out, but this is the kind of thing that we're thinking of. So all of this is to say, when I'm making a decision about how compressed the vocal should be or how much low end should be in the guitars or how much low end should be in the bass, like, I kind of need to have these targets in mind, because if I'm not mixing with some imprint in my head of what the end product needs to sound like, or even so what it should look like in terms of metering and distribution, if I have no concept of that, it's going to be very difficult for me to consistently produce mixes that fit within the genre conventions that they're competing with. Because at the end of the day, when we play our music next to somebody else's the way somebody would on a playlist, it shouldn't feel unrelated to the genre we're trying to be a part of, right? And this is not to say that it needs to be identical, but there are certain conventions that is basically the common knowledge, or like the best practices if you're going to make this type of record. It generally needs to be like this because this is what we found out for 20 years kind of works for a pop record, a rock record, a dance record, whatever. So this is all very focused on the big picture, and I'm very happy to jump into the smaller picture, but first just I want to field anything that we just talked about that is confusing, because I understand this might be a ton of totally new information for a lot of you. So let's just hit any questions, comments, reactions to this type of thing, and then we'll get into what I consider the much more minutia of, okay, now I'm setting up a compressor with, some general things in mind.
Hey, Logan.
Yes.
So I kind of missed the first bit of this, but is this mastering that you're doing?
Yes.
Okay.
Or this is what I would argue is like mixing for the master.
For the master.
Like, these are the type of things that I need to know when I'm making at least
Gotcha.
the final critical mixing decisions, but like I can't consider a mix finished unless I know these things about it. So yes, it does have to do with like final loudness level and all that stuff. But yes, this is the reverse thing I was talking about, is starting with, the final ideas of where do we need to get, what is the deliverable package in terms of what qualities does it have compared to yada yada yada, and then going backwards. Yeah, so this is very much in what I would call the last 50% of mixing into mastering for sure. There's definitely a lot more mastering stuff we could talk about, but I kind of feel like I'm shooting over a little bit of people's heads here. So yes. So thank you for clarifying. Yeah, this is much more final mixing into mastering than this is just the minutia of mixing.
One thing I wanted to say, or to mention at least, was a good thing to practice with, or like one thing that I found that really helped to practice with, is to find like softwares. Like, you'll start using Weathervane in recording one, but another one is like Nail the Mix or something. These software providers, more or less, that give you multi-tracks from bands, and then they also give you a track that the actual person that has mixed and mastered the album has done. In terms of practice, try getting your version of it as close to theirs as possible. And if it's not close, like, critically jump back and forth, like kind of what Logan's doing here with the two different reference tracks. But you're doing it with the same track between yours and theirs. But jump back and forth to be like, okay, what is my mix missing that their mix has? Or something like that, to give yourself a baseline.
Yeah, and that's an even more direct version, like you said, of what we're doing here. So here we're definitely listening to all those things and frequencies, knowing that they are different songs, because obviously we can't have somebody else's reference of the song we're mixing and mastering. But yeah, like that critical information, or even that style of ear training, because that's also very different from like, oh, like I'm listening to only 500 hertz and now I know what 500 hertz sound like. Like, knowing 500 hertz being too quiet for a rock record, that's a very down the line thing of ear critical listening, right? That's not just 500. It's not just 500 boosted by 12 dB. It's like 500 feels a little lacking and I need to fix it for this record to translate properly. And even a more extreme version of what Grant mentioned is something called a null test. So this is something you could do in a situation like that. So a null test basically means if we have two things and we remove all the similarities of them, all that will remain is what's different, right? So the way we do this in audio, Michael Klein, why don't you tell us a little bit about phase? This will lead into this conversation.
Oh, okay. So if two audio signals are exactly identical and you put them out of phase with one another, completely 180 degrees out of phase, they will entirely cancel out.
Yes, 100%. And what we're talking about, phase, is just the ups and downs, the valleys and troughs of air pressure polarity. So basically, just you can even just look at it visually, like, is it an up or is it a down? If it's two ups together, additive, they'll make each other louder. Like if you play two mixes that are exactly the same at the same time, they will make each other louder, right? But if you play two mixes at the exact same time that are inverted phase, where every hill is a valley, they will cancel each other out exactly. So here's the thing: if you do the thing that Grant was talking about, and you mix a song that's already been mixed, so you definitely have this ability through Weathervane. I think they either typically give you a reference track, or it's a track that's like been released through them, and you can find a way to get that track. You can put them at the exact same moment, like literally wave to wave, as zoomed in as you can. And if you flip the phase on one of them, the things that are identical will cancel out. So for instance, say your mixes were exactly the same, except theirs has way more low end, and you flip the phase, all the high end information will go away, and all you'll hear was just a bunch of low end that you didn't have in your mix. So there's so many ways, and I think the thing that I'm trying to like illustrate here, these are all just tools, it doesn't matter which tools you use, is just there's a lot of ways to be critical about audio. I think there's this kind of like unhelpful myth, particularly when it comes to mastering, that it's all just like secret juju vibe bullshit. It's not. Like it's years of just knowing what records that sound good sound like, and then having all of this critical information. So when you're like, I want to make like the coolest neo jazz record, you kind of need to know what good neo jazz records sound like, or else yours might end up being a very weird offshoot of the genre that doesn't satisfy what that genre needs to satisfy, right? And all of this is talking about frequency distribution, loudness, width, yada yada yada. We can go into more of that, which this is I would kind of consider this the first like maybe 20% of the mastering chain. We're kind of going at it from two ends, like the final loudness and the first EQ stage. I don't want to go too far with this, but basically this is the idea that will just get you further on in terms of like, oh, how wide is my mix compared to other mixes in the genre? How saturated what's the difference between how much information is just in the middle channel, so shared evenly by both speakers, versus the information that is not shared? So like the stuff that lives in the middle is like the kick, snare, usually lead vocal, lead guitar, anything like that. Sometimes like shaker gets put in there, stuff like that. What is the volume difference between that stuff that is sitting in the, phantom center, right? There's no center speaker, so it's just what is shared evenly sounds like the center. What is the volume difference between that information that's shared in the center versus the stuff that makes it sound wide by not being the same? And how can I manually change that volume over time to create more impact? Like there's so many little pieces to it, but it all requires this really critical understanding of how to evaluate what is or is not working about your mix compared to other things. Because if you're just doing this in the dark based on your own reference, what will happen, and happens to everybody, and this is why I said like the worst moment in anyone's mix career is the first time that they like do the A/B reference between their mix and someone else's. Because you can listen to your mix 100 hours in a row, lose all objectivity, you think it's the greatest thing you've ever heard in the world, you play it next to a mix that you know is good, that everybody thinks is good, and it sounds nothing like it remotely. Like, that is a very bad feeling. So like this is a way to take that very bad, very critical feeling in a very positive light of saying like, okay, the information I've gained from this is that this genre, I mean, you could do a bunch of different references, it doesn't have to be only one track, but like the things I can expect is that like, oh, my low mids are like super scooped and theirs seem super boosted, and that's a big part of like why this bass sounds good on my laptop speakers, but my bass I can't even hear. Like things like that are really basic critical things that will give you information you need to improve your mixes. But I don't want to go too far into this because I know, like I said, this is very zoomed out, thinking about the final thing. I think a lot of what a lot of people are going into is like, oh cool, this is great, but like how do I make my vocal sit in the mix to get to the point where I'd have to worry about that? So let's grab just any more stuff on this, and then I'll probably jump into a different mix that has a lot more going on in it. Not necessarily in terms of like loudness or competition within genre, but just in terms of layers competing with each other frequency-wise and volume-wise. And then we'll look a little bit more specifically on like the EQ and compression choices. So any other reactions, thoughts, questions, frustrations with this stuff? Any reactions at all? Thanks, Mike. Yeah, like I said, I have I am deeply fascinated with all of this. I have no concept to which any of this is or is not interesting. It's all fascinating to me. So please, if I'm spending 20 minutes on something that you're like nobody cares, just tell me. It's perfectly fine. So I'm going to jump to a different mix. You'll lose my screen for a second. So I'm going to jump to a different mix, and we'll talk a little bit about those minor things. So the main thing that I want to touch on is that one of the hardest things when you're mixing is like, am I making it better or worse? I don't know, because the loss of objectivity is like just part of mixing. That's why you need to take mix breaks. Like the greatest engineer in the world doesn't sit in a room for 8 hours and mix straight through without breaks. Like that's just a physiologically not great choice to do. And if you hear classic stories of like, you know, them mixing Thriller, like, I don't know how many, they mixed it like 50 times and then picked like the 7th mix. Just stuff like that is just like so silly to me, because it's not helping anybody. And when the more objectivity you can put into it, even though it's not going to make you feel good at first, the more objectivity you can put into it, the better place you'll be in terms of making decisions that you really trust. So let's talk about some of those smaller decisions. I'm going to open up another session. So this is a much more competitive in that there's a lot more things vying for your attention, or it's made up of more discrete parts. So let me share this. Good Lord, is it popping
say
up?
a quick point on
Please.
a good thing that excuse me, like what you were mentioning with fatigue and stuff like that.
Oh yeah.
Like sometimes I find myself just not noticing that it's happening. Like I'll be sitting there sometimes just like in the heat of it. It's been like 3 hours or something, and I'll like stop for a hot second. Like I'll actually stop, not for like just a second to move it around, like a full 30 seconds. Then like the pressure starts just like sitting on your ears. You start feeling the fatigue. You just start feeling tired and stuff. So that's really important to be able to notice that and just be like, okay, I just need to take a break or just take a quick nap or something.
For sure, yeah. I feel like there's so little value in white knuckling a mix. Like, yeah, like there's just a point to you. Basically, there's a point of diminishing returns the longer you work on something in a row without either taking breaks or taking reference breaks, or just like you said, a full minute not listening to anything and then coming back on it fresh. Like basically, you can still make good decisions, but the amount of objectivity you have just in terms of like this imagined final product you're shooting for, or, you know, the objectivity of like how well your ears work, period, all of those things are going to start to go down. Yeah, and I agree. I think there is, it's really hard to describe. I've really never had a good chance, like never heard someone describe this really well, but I think you kind of touched on it. There is kind of a physical sensation. It's almost like when you get out of like a loud, like you just saw a show and you're walking home and there's just kind of this, like, even if your ears aren't ringing, there's kind of like almost like a brain throb. It's kind of like that to a lesser extent. It's a little bit more into the surface, like the start of a migraine or something. But yeah, like there is a very physical element there that you can't mix objectively for 4 hours straight. You and no one can. Yeah, like, so doing that, you'll end up getting worse results than if you mixed for an hour and a half, took a half hour to eat dinner, came back at it. So yeah, that's what I'm saying with white knuckling. So going back to a different Pro Tools session. So this is more big, like alt rock, melodic, shoegazy something or other. So there is a lot more going on here. You can't see them, but these are my drums. There is more like sample-based stuff. There's essentially more dynamics built into this where like the verses have a different drum and bass and guitar sound. They're cleaner and less huge. And then it's more about the dynamic payoff than it is about just everything staying big and fighting each other for the whole time. So let's just listen to like, let's just listen to Getting Into a Chorus.
It's innocent, so don't ask me. I don't have any better guess than you. I must be having too much fun, but I'm not the only one tasting the forbidden fruit. There is no absolute. There is no absolute. There's nothing that's always true.
Cool, so we'll just look at that for now. And actually, this is more of a production thing, but something I planned to talk to on the other song, but didn't because we were kind of in that zoomed out place, is that I find the place where a lot of people end up stopping just short of where you kind of do need to keep going is really the last 10% of the production and mix. Like, and by this I'm saying, like, you of course need good performances, right? You need things to be in time to feel good, right? You need them to be in tune to feel good. You need like some sort of emotional reason for the listener to be invested. But even more than that, even just like, cool, I tracked the drums, I tracked the guitars, I tracked the bass, I tracked the vocals, I must be done. There's definitely a layer beyond that to like, how can you take that last 10% chance, and this is what I was saying before, to do something that's probably more technical than strictly musical, but something creative that can create a bigger impact to the things that are already there. So like, for instance, this transition is a really important transition. I'll give more time. So really, all that was originally is just like a chord holds out and then a big louder chord comes in. But like, there's a lot of other stuff happening besides that that makes that moment work, right? If it was just exactly as tracked, something transitions normally, the moment would be fine and it would work, but it would just have less impact. So in the idea of what I think is super valuable in terms of maximizing impact, basically taking everything the furthest it can go. So one thing we talked about in the other song, and one of the reasons I started with the other song, something it didn't have a lot of, is the idea of tension and release, that basically for something to be big, something needs to be small. For something to feel really wide, something needs to be really narrow. For something to feel really full spectrum, it needs to be really limited spectrum. So here, loudness is the obvious thing, right? Quiet, and then very loud. But there's a bunch of things that set us up for that. So just hearing some of these other things that happen, just with the idea of how can we basically make the downbeat of this chorus bigger than just what we naturally had in tracking. So first things is just like some really obvious things is like samples. Cool, let's use samples to do it. So one's going to be like a building of tension, and one's going to be a payoff, and the payoff is also going to extend our frequency range, right? So here's the building of tension. Cool. And then the payoff is, which, I mean, depends on what you're listening to. It's a sub. So if you just heard boop, that means that you don't have a lot of low end. But essentially it's a sub. So essentially we get this sweeping motion that basically is growing in volume, and then it pays off to something that extends the lowest part of our frequency canvas a little bit further. Cool. But that's not all that's happening. There's still other things happening. So let's see what else is happening. Cool, and then there's also this sort of like tape slowdown effect for impact. Right, so all of this is creating one thing, and you'll see that a lot of these have the same thing going on in terms of the tape slowdown effect. Basically, it creates one moment, like maybe a quarter note before the chorus happens, where suddenly everything is quieter and just sort of slides away into nothing. Right, so basically all this to say, like, if those things weren't there, it would still work, right? Like, it would still be a verse that goes into a chorus. It would just be a lot less of a moment when it happens. It would be a lot less, basically, things sliding away gives your brain a chance to, like, realize what loud is by taking away half loud, goes to, like, almost nothing. Suddenly, full loud sounds way louder than if half loud just immediately went to full loud. So if you listen to any EDM song, they're amazing at this. Like, it'll be like you're building up to a drop, suddenly everything starts getting really mono, and all like the lows start going away, and then the highs start pulling in, and everything feels like really boxy and tight, and then they just open up every parameter at once, and it feels monstrously huge. Like that's a very, very good example of what I'm talking about. Basically using something highly technical to create this very emotional response that you wouldn't have if you were just like, cool, playback, and then the drop happens and it's fine. Like, you kind of want to maximize that stuff. Cool. So now let's sort of build this mix up from the bottom. I mean, there's a lot going on here, but essentially this is much more competitive in terms of, like, there's a lot of things happening at once that we kind of need to hear simultaneously. So one of the things I said early on, that what mixing really is it's sort of choosing, it's sort of building in the competition and choosing what you want the listener to focus on, right? So there's a couple things we need to accomplish simultaneously. I mean, there's a lot of things simultaneously, but what we need to accomplish is, like, you have to be able to hear the vocal level at a level that's appropriate for the genre. So this is not to say that the vocal should sit on top all the time, because if you listen to a Nirvana record, which this is kind of going for more of that My Bloody Valentine meets Nirvana, kind of like grungy, shoegazy, like a little bit more of that raw kind of garage rock type of guitar tone and sound, versus like a pop record. A pop record, the vocal always sits way, way, way on top, right? To the point where it can become problematic, because if the vocal, and I'll use this word threatened, if the vocal is never threatened by the instrumentation, like there's never a chance that the vocal, it just in our minds is ever going to be overtaken, or like it doesn't need to work hard to get louder than it kind of starts sounding like a backing track, right? Kind of sounds like karaoke, and it doesn't have as much energy as if the mix is here and the vocals like just barely above it. It has a lot more energy because you feel that it's louder, right? Like we've all been to a show where like you can barely hear the vocal and the vocalist starts like singing louder to be heard. Like that's a very different energy thing than like here's the backing track that never changes and here's the vocalist 6 dB above that. Neither of them is right or wrong, but they have a very different emotional feeling in terms of the vocalist energy feels very different based on that. So there's a couple things we need to feel. We need to like know what the harmony is, essentially, right? Like we have to know what the harmonic backdrop is so that the monophonic melody means anything, right? So we need to understand what the chord is going on. We need to understand what the vocal is doing at whatever level is right for the genre, in some cases, like a little bit in the mix, a little bit threatened by the mix, as opposed to like way above it, just two very different emotional endpoints. And then we also kind of need to know like what's the rhythm component. Even if we're not actively thinking about it and hopefully not distracted by it, we still need to be able to be moved by the kick and snare. Like if we literally can't find the kick and snare, we try to find it and we still can't find it, it basically means that like its ability to do what it needs to do in the mix has been compromised. So we don't necessarily need the kick and snare to stick out wildly and threaten the vocal, but we definitely can't have them buried enough that they are unfindable and lost in a muddy mess. So we need to have the rhythm present, we need to have the harmony present, we need to have the vocals present, and then in a much broader sense, texturally, we need to accomplish whatever is trying to be accomplished here. So here it's kind of a lo-fi, grungy thing, and we'll see how that's built up. So let's just start with drums and bass. So this is basically things that are not for our purpose that we are actively thinking about these sounds or these performances necessarily, but this is kind of the backdrop that we're going to build all the other stuff on. So all the harmony, all the vocals. If this thing doesn't work, like if the drums and bass just like don't make any sense together and they don't make sense hearing them at the same time in a mix, then all the stuff that goes on top of them is just going to be built on this very shaky foundation. So let's talk about this bass tone, because it's a little bit of an interesting bass tone. So one of the things that can easily happen with any bass guitar, and I'm sure any bassist can attest to this, is if you listen, the cleaner the bass guitar is, and we'll talk about this, but basically the cleaner and smoother the bass guitar is, which typically means like the more presence in the very low end fundamentals and the less harmonics going up the frequency range, essentially it has a much cleaner, deeper feeling, but also based on what we just talked about with translation, if all of your bass lives at like between 100 and 200 and your cell phone can't reproduce 100 and 200, your mix will not have bass when you play it on a cell phone. Like there's certain realities of that, and so basically to accommodate that for the last, you know, basically since the 70s, since like Chris Squire, bassists have started adding harmonics and adding distortion to the sound. So there's a lot of ways that we can build this in, but the goal here is not to create the smoothest, deepest bass, it's to create a balanced bass that has a strong low-end presence as well as enough grit and harmonic information in the highs and the mids that it still can compete with the guitars and you can still hear what the bass note is even if you can't hear the lowest fundamental that it's producing, right? So there's a lot of ways to create this. So let's first listen to just what was tracked. So what was tracked, I'm sure, is just a DI out of my bass pedal board. So again, and we're going to talk a lot about the difference between like isolation and reference. So you could say in isolation, I don't like this bass tone at all. I hate it. But isolation doesn't matter. What matters is we have harmonics, we have mids, we have a decent amount of lows, although we could use more. Basically, this is giving us what I would say too much information, right? There's some lows, lots of mids, there's some high mids, there's harmonics, there's stuff. So we have something we need to carve, essentially. But I would rather have too information than too little. So I was probably tracking into this. This just comes with Pro Tools. There's a couple plugins. This one, and particularly Lo-Fi, I use on every session I ever do, and they just come with Pro Tools, they are amazingly good. So this is a modification of a preset called SVT. Like if you've ever played an SVT amp, they kind of have a natural scoops quality, big, low bottom end, but then also some bite and some attack. Really what we're going for is the attack of hearing the note sound, hearing it have some presence, not the presence range, but presence in the mix in terms of we can hear the note being sounded more than just the low end fundamental filling the low end. We want that, but we need way more than that for this to compete in this huge, big, loud rock mix. And we'll hear these guitars. We'll hear why this bass needs to be so distorted and competitive. So I'm sure I tracked into this. So essentially this is the DI. This is basically the DI hitting the amp. And if you know anything about amps, the information you put into it, there's not a logarithmic like, oh, you put 20 more decibels into the input, it's going to be the same thing 20 decibels louder. No, like basically there's a headroom every amp has, and the further you go above it, the grittier, more distorted, more harmonic they're going to become. So basically, the amount that this DI signal is hitting this virtual bass amp is the same way as if it was hitting a real bass amp, where there's a period that it's going to start getting dirtier and grindier and add even more harmonics to it. So let's listen to just the huge difference of just taking this DI sound and then going into an amp modeler. And again, this is a totally free amp modeler that if you have any version of Pro Tools, you already have. Pretty drastic, and we can see I'm not being shy about this stuff. I'm boosting the lows all the way up. I'm boosting the highs. There's a natural scooping quality. That's the punch being taken out. Crunch and drive and buzz. There's a lot of things that are pushing harmonics here, but I'm taking out the mids that I don't find useful, and I'm keeping the mids in that I do. So again, just same comparison. Cool. So both of these, so this is a plugin that I was tracking into, but I would say both of these are like part of my core bass sound that I was tracking into. And then after that is just a little bit, you'll just see minor movement just to control level. So compressors, and we'll talk about this especially when we get to vocals, there is a huge difference to how you can use compressors, because you could use a compressor to just sort of control the level, to say like, hey, once you get past this point, just be a little less loud. And that's kind of what this is doing. It's just saying like, oh, you got a decibel too loud, I'm going to turn you down a decibel. And that's how you're kind of taught to think about compression, is this like, here's the threshold, things above it get turned down. All of that is 100% true. But there's also so many compressors out there, and they're built differently, and they have different components, and all of these modeled compressors are modeled after these vintage units that, you know, have these reputations for doing these specific things. A lot of compressors have a distinct sound to them. This is not necessarily one of them. We'll talk about that more with the 76 and like distressor style compressors on vocals. So here I'm not going for a sound. This is just the same way that if I had to manually automate the level, I'd be like, oh, you're getting a little too loud, I'm going to turn you down. It's just doing it automatically. So we'll probably see between 1 and 2 decibels of reduction, maybe 3 sometimes. So, and this is even a question, so not even a question, it's one of the things to think about. Like, so even if you're not the bassist and you're tracking the bassist, what are some things on a bass, regardless of what you're tracking it through, that can make different notes sound at different volumes? So any bassist can answer. So jump in basses. What makes certain notes, you're playing a bass line, certain notes are louder than others? What's one of the reasons why?
I mean, just your performance makes a difference.
Sure, absolutely. What's something you have even less control over?
Your amplifier, your tone settings on your bass itself,
Sure.
being new versus old.
One of the biggest things I would say is which string you're playing on, because think about it, if you play a low D on your low B string, that note is, just by virtue of how big the string is compared to your high D, those notes are going to be at a different volume. Or if you played an E on your low B string versus an open E on your E string, those notes will be at a different volume. So even just that fact of, even if you know that and you're performing to that, knowing that, there's still going to be a volume difference that you have to manage while you're doing it. So the idea of needing a compressor just for that reason alone makes perfect sense, that you need 1 or 2 decibels to be controlled as you go, because there are certain things, even if you're considering it when you're performing, that you don't really have full control over, right? So we can even see it. I mean, obviously, this waveform is not super dynamic, right? Like, it's mostly sticking in the same place, but we can see there are moments where we do have peaks, and there are moments where individual notes will present themselves as louder, where we get more reduction. Cool. So why does this bass sound need to be so driven and so crazy? We'll look at the difference of it first, but let's listen to these guitars, and we'll get some idea why. I'm just going to keep adding guitars. Cool. So, and this is another thing when it comes to tracking. This is more of a production thing, but like that's a pretty distinctive guitar sound that you can't accomplish with one guitar, right? So, like these guitars are doing very different things, and they all are treated very differently in tonally. So, like here's the. So I'll go like least important to most important. Right, so some trem-picked guitars with a lot of saturation, a lot of, it's like a delay hitting the front end of a fuzz pedal, and then you have these like kind of swirly, half-clean guitars with lots of modulation. And then you have these very big, beefy guitars. Cool. So it's worth noting, all of these guitars sound very different from each other, right? So just even from the conception stage of like the part, the tone, everything, different choices being made. But you can tell that they're not all trying to be the same thing either. So let's start with the most foundational guitars, and let's talk about like sort of the qualities this guitar has. So where does this guitar live? This is the interactive portion.
Low mid.
Low mid, absolutely 100% correct. Yeah, so like we can hear it doesn't have a lot of low lows, right? And it definitely doesn't have a lot of highs, right? So it's sitting in this almost like if you were to make the sound be like wah, like it's kind of nasal and like a little dark and throaty. I would describe these guitars as throaty. Cool. So basically these guitars are basically trying to pick up where the bass left off, right? We have the bass that's covering the low end. We have this like gritty presence in the bass, and then it basically probably overlapping, but like into the next frequency range. These guitars are kind of low mid, kind of picking up right where the bass left off. So let's just start by hearing the bass, and then let's add these guitars. So essentially you'll hear we're just like starting the sonic picture in the low end. We're just going to keep growing it and growing it until we've covered every frequency imaginable is going to be the point, because the point of this chorus is that it's really big, overwhelmingly huge, and it's filling the whole frequency spectrum, but also that as some of this like mid-focused garage like trash acid band big muff harshness, like this is very much about the sound of like a fuzz pedal hitting an amp. So to me, those make perfect sense together, right? Like you can still hear the bass when they play together. A lot of times with the bass, and this is not a bad thing, but like in a cleaner style of music, the clean bass will just sound like an extension of the low end of the guitars, which is why people are like, oh, I never think about the bass because I can't hear the bass. You'll really notice it if that bass goes away. Suddenly the guitar sounds super, super thin. In this case, the bass still has enough presence that you can hear what the bass is doing even with these guitars. But to the same extent, their style of grittiness is supposed to, the end result of what we're trying to create is what should sound like one very, very big guitar, right? It's all building together to one block of sound that's going to support our vocal. It's just one portion of the mix, right? It's the harmonic sonic bit. So here's the bass and guitars. All right, let's add these other guitars. So where do these live? Where do these guitars live?
Presence.
A little lower, but yeah, but it's
high mid.
They're much brighter than the other ones, right? And I would call these, I would say that these are intentionally a little harsh. Like right when I first jump into that, it's like, oh Lord, that's like kind of a lot. And you can see there's not a huge amount going on here. A lot of it is just the sound I got at the source, but you can see some of the choices being made here, saying like, okay, this is kind of a nice warm round place, let's take that out. This is really fizzy stuff. So let's boost up here. This kind of 1.23, this is kind of like the big shining reason these guitars exist in this kind of harsh area. Right? So we have our bass, we have our low mid guitars, so like where these are cutting is very much where those other guitars are. So let's listen to those other guitars, and let's hear how they interact together. I'll actually take the bass out, yeah. So let's hear, so here's our other guitars. Cool, and now let's listen again. I'm just going to take out both of their EQs. So it's not night and day, although it is better. It's definitely cleaner. It's leaving more room for the bass. It kind of melds them together. They're fighting over less of the same areas, and they kind of have their own purpose, so they kind of widen out a little bit better. But again, and this is kind of, I think the reason we talked about this, we were talking about this in the acoustic class, like when it comes to like how do you EQ a guitar and you open up an equalizer, you're like kind of missing the point, because how you EQ an acoustic guitar is like, well, where did you put the mic? Like if you want a really big bright sound that has lots of lows and virtually no mids, and you put you put a really flat condenser mic at the bridge, you're going to get the exact opposite of that, and you might have to work super hard in your EQ to make things happen that weren't there at the source. The reason these EQs don't need to work very hard is that I had a very clear idea of what I wanted to create at the source, and then these are just kind of doing the carving. So if anybody's not used to looking at an EQ like this, all this is saying is like, for the high mids for that frequency band, like what is the frequency 2.8? Is it being boosted or cut? It's being boosted by 5. And then what is the Q? Is it super sharp or is it super wide? So here it's right in the middle. So if you're not used to looking at one of these, basically you have filters, things cutting in on the sides the way you would see in like your 7 band, just sweeping in the sides, lows and highs. And then just basically, are we boosting or cutting? So here we can see that I'm cutting a bunch of the lows with a bell curve. So actually, I think the most drastic difference is if we listen to these low guitars, which is this guy right here. I'm brightening them up in a decent amount of ways. They're still not bright, they're still not sharp, and if you notice, I am actually cutting out like, 16K and above, but I'm creating a lot more brightness, and I'm taking away a good bit of the low end. I'm cutting everything below 190, and I'm reducing 4 dB of 450. So essentially, I'm cutting the places where I know it's going to fight the bass. So here's without the EQ. Darker and more low end. So I don't want darker and more low end. I want more high end and less low end, because I know what my basses are in. Cool. And an interesting note about electric guitars, if you ever checked electric guitars, you definitely already know this, but like, if you look at these guitars are, I would call these the opposite of dynamic, right? They are not dynamic at all, because what distortion does, or overdrive, or in this case fuzz, just an extreme version of those, what it does, it's a very extreme form of compression, right? Like a fuzzed out guitar, if you barely touch it and you slam it as hard as you can, the volume difference will be like 2 dB. Like it's just so slammed. Everything is way above the the impedance and the threshold for headroom and clarity. Like everything about them, whether you play them quiet or loud, as we can see with most of these, is that you're not going to get that. As opposed to, say, something like an acoustic guitar, or if we look at like a cleaner guitar part, which is definitely somewhere. Yeah, so like a cleaner bass, a cleaner guitar part, most of these have some level on it. Or if we look at, like a vocal is obviously going to have more dynamics to it than a really blaringly fuzzed out guitar. I mean, that's in the verse, but it's still, most of everything's pretty dirty here. So so a lot of stuff at the source, but still carving afterwards that. So let's bring our last guitars into the mix and let's see what they're doing. And it's also worth saying we're at the chorus. And it's also worth saying, like, I wouldn't say that like this that I'm necessarily thinking about this in the way that I'm describing it, in this very academic way of like, well, I know that my bass goes up to this frequency, so I should cut that frequency out. Like, you just have to use your ears to make decisions. You shouldn't just be like, well, my bass has 300 hertz in it, so I should drop 9 decibels of 300 hertz in the next thing. That might have a cumulatively bad effect, right? You still have to use your ears, but it definitely gives you a starting point if you're not sure where to approach it. Let's hear what the last type of guitar is. So I'll have this one, I'll add the secondary guitars. And worth mentioning, that kind of harsh frequency, there's not a ton of other stuff there. I mean, there's some for sure, but like, it's kind of laying into a place where nobody else is. It kind of has its own place in the mix. Cool, so that's kind of our flowing mix. Here's the last one. And these are kind of trying to live in between those places, right? They're like between the mids and the high mids. And if you'll notice too, the way that these are panned, they're panned in between the left and the right. So these are really just thickeners, right? So when I drop these in, it doesn't feel like the guitar sound significantly changes. It just melds a little bit of everything together. So these are kind of like the peanut butter that's marrying the two sides of the sandwich together. And we'll see what they're doing as well. Yeah, so you can see like kind of the opposite of where this other guy was. it's kind of fighting in that same place where it is in the mids. It's just not cutting all of this information below it. It's cutting more of the high stuff. But essentially, yeah, this is to marry all that stuff together and really meld it together into one guitar sound. This provides a little bit more width because you'll notice all these other guitars, the left and the right, are doing the same thing. So if we listen to these guitars individually, they're different performances, but they're accomplishing the same thing. So that will sound really balanced. And balance is like something I would say that I'm like kind of obsessive with in terms of mixing. Like even if I take my limiter off, like if you look at my master output, it's never going to be significantly one-sided. It might alternate between the left and right being louder, but it'll definitely be balanced between not one is significantly louder than the others. One thing to create a little bit more width is we perceive width as things being different. So a guitar playing chords on this side and the guitar with the same tone playing the same chords will sound wider and it will sound like one balanced guitar, but it won't really create width the way that two guitars playing two different things will. So listen to these, and they're 50-50 instead of 100. But we can feel there's something about the left and right that is not quite as balanced as everything else is. Cool. So that's our basic chorus sound. There's other things going on. We'll look at vocal layers at the end. So essentially, like I said, we have this more of a built-in structure here in the production where the verses are quieter and then the choruses are louder. So that's great up until we hit the point where we need to get either way bigger or way smaller. So that's typically either the bridge. In this case, it just kind of goes to an outro. So let's look about how we do that. So essentially, what I think about in times like these, when we're going to basically, we've created a top, that's our chorus, and now we're like, we need to top that. Was basically, so we can't lose anything, right? We have to maintain all of the energy, all of the frequency expansion that we already have, but now we have to add more to it. So this is what I was talking also about in terms of like the last 10% of production is the things you notice the least but make the most difference. It's this type of stuff that it's like, okay, you could just go to your outro, not add anything else, and the song would still be the song and it would still work, but like, that's obviously not going to be a climax if everything stays at the same volume and intensity level and the same frequency distribution and it just keeps doing that. It's just going to be less impactful over time. So let's explore the ways to like, we're at a peak and now we need to do more with it. And sure, it's a big rock song, but also if you listen critically to any pop song, there's a reason why the last chorus typically goes twice and then has like a refrain from earlier in the song come back, and then the vocalist kind of does an ad-lib and riffs over it, and they save their highest notes for that, right? Like, there's a natural expectation that we reach sort of an arc peak and after the last 2/3 of the song that we need to kind of go out with a bang unless we're really kind of playing with expectation. So this, in any genre, is kind of the norm that, like, even if you set a peak over and over like we hit the chorus, there needs to be some way we get above that. Cool. So it got bigger because it had to, right? Like, we're going to talk about some technical reasons, but just musically, it's obvious it's a big moment. It needs to get bigger, right? So all the things that we're doing, we're hypothetically, like, we've gone as big as we can thus far to have everything we have. So, like, we have, you know, the drums going, we have this dirty bass, and we have the, I believe, 6 different guitars. I mean, most of them are doing the same thing, but yeah, essentially we have 3 guitar parts. They're all double tracked, and that's what's going on here. So here's like the tag. Cool. And we do have something I didn't mention, which is guitars that are doing something very different. And these are kind of a callback to the verse. So same thing with the verse. If you have verse 1 and then you have verse 2, if verse 1 was already here and you hit a chorus and it feels bigger and you just go back to this same exact verse with nothing different about the production whatsoever, that is like a real anticlimax, because now we know what big is. Like here when we first heard verse 1, we don't know what big is. This could be the whole song, could be at this volume level, this intensity, this frequency distribution, but now we know what loud is. So if we just go back to that original volume level, it's going to feel way quieter and way less important than the first time around. So one thing you'll notice in like this other verse like has more things going on in verse 2 than we did in verse 1, right? Like we add some synths, the drums get louder, there's more things going on because we need to keep building up the intensity. We can't just drop down to what we heard before. Even subconsciously, we're going to get very bored and very unexcited about that. But there is a sound from the verse very different from the other guitars that we now have in the mix. Again, double tracked. Here, these, like the tremolo guitars, are 50-50 instead of 100-100, because so many of things in this mix are fully LCR, 100% left, dead in the middle, or 100% right. There's just a few little things that kind of fill out that space here. So we've kept these in. So typically, these are just in the verse, and then they're not in the first chorus. And then they're in verse 2, and then they remain in the chorus. So that's why even subconsciously this chorus is a little bit fuller than the first one, because we have this texture that we're familiar with, these really sparkly guitars going on with all these dirty chords. It's going to make it feel just that much bigger. So we maintain these through, so we've added something from chorus 1 that we still have through. Let's grab all the stuff that we've already listened to, and then we got to figure out a way to make all of this stuff bigger and louder than the big loud thing it already is. I'm just going to jump to the end of the tag. Cool. So one cue thing is, and again, all these things work together, right? Like you can't separate, in my mind at least, you can't separate the mix from the master. You can't separate the arrangement from the production, the performance from the, processing. Like it all works together. And this is what I was saying, like you have to have a really strong idea of where you want to go. Because if you don't think about what you want your final product to be until you've already tracked all the performances, then you're already you've already lost 100 of your chances to make everything as cool as possible. So built into the arrangement, so this is the tag the first time. So this is kind of the post-chorus. So here's the post-chorus of chorus 1. And there's vocals in there as well. And then here's the post-chorus of the second chorus. It's a bit different. Right, so instead of going to this rhythmic thing, which is our cue that we're transitioning, we have this held out thing. And as opposed to this tag, we now have denser harmonies. So we keep adding to the production more and more and more and more. So we have a lot of cues that things are getting bigger, and then we extend the arrangement, so it all works together. Part of the production choice is the arrangement. So here's the tag. It goes this long. Here's that tag. It goes the exact same amount, but then it extends that tag, and now we revert back to the rhythmic thing. So we get this whole tag sustained, then we get more information rhythmic, so we just keep stacking up the intensity, right? So here's the tag sustained, and then we get an additional section that's rhythmic, and then we get an additional section after that that gets bigger. And then we have to get bigger than we've already been. Cool. So let's build this mix from the bottom up. So there are other things going on, subtler things, subs and impacts. Like for instance, here's some behind the. I'll take away the drums. Pretty subtle, right? But they make a subtle, important difference. To just like, oh hey, maybe for some reason this tag feels spacious. You're hearing just like a big reverb wash of no information really, just a big reverb wash. That stuff all plays kind of psychologically behind the scenes, so it's important to have that stuff in there. But yeah, let's grab all the things we normally have and figure out how we can make this bigger, excluding the vocals for a second. So yeah, that's everything except for the sparkles, which we said that we added, that were not in chorus 1. So here, we have the chorus. So when the chorus hits, is bigger than chorus 1, right? Because now we have the sparkly guitars that we didn't have before. And then we hit the tag, which is the same as the last tag, except we've changed the rhythm. So instead of having this rhythmic figure, it's this really sustained figure, and then we added more harmonies. And then the production adds a tag to that now gives us the rhythmic transition thing, which we know is leading us into the next thing. So we keep stacking it. So thus far, not a single one of these sections from verse 1, chorus 1, tag 1, verse 2, chorus 2, tag 2, tags, tag 2, none of them have been identical, right? Each of them has been bigger than the one before it, and that's like deeply, deeply important, at least to me, that like if it's, so like worst case scenario, if chorus 2 was quieter than chorus 1 and it had less going on, that is such a momentum killer, right? Like, we want to keep the listener engaged through everything. We want to pull out every trick we can in the book, everything we can do to keep them engaged and interested, we're going to do it. So let's hear, the tag going to the new tag going to the outro. Cool. So that was without the extra stuff. We can tell it still has kind of a lift there because now we get a new part that's happening in these trems. So those raise in importance, but we also start to get some new information. So let's be honest, none of that stuff is make or break stuff. Like if I muted all of that stuff, which I can do, like the mix isn't gonna fall apart, right? Like that is not a structural basic thing that if it leaves, the track fails, right? But it is subtle stuff that, I mean, I'll actually just highlight it. It is subtle stuff that if we didn't have all of this stuff, whoops, I did bad. If we didn't have all of this stuff, I'm just gonna throw in my group real quick. Extra unnecessary. If we didn't have all of this stuff, it would be, I would say, it would be fundamentally less emotionally compelling. So let's listen to it with and then without, and it's going to be subtle. I would tell you right up, like it's not going to be night and day. It's going to be a mild difference of emotional impact. So here's with, I'll give it 2 bars. 2 bars, I said, Pro Tools. Don't disobey me. So I will admit that that is fairly subtle, but I will also say that I have an unmistakably, undeniably different feeling about those two things, and they're not night and day. They're very minor things. They're totally, this isn't even last 10%, this is like last 5%, and we can hear these things are not critical. But they are different, and they are a little special. Like, for instance, this synth sound, it happens in the verse. So like this is kind of a callback, same as those like sparkly guitars happen in the verse. This is kind of like the other side of the production elements of this song. It's like this is the Hyde to the fuzzed out guitar's Jekyll, right? Like this is about as opposite as a guitar sound as you can be. So superimposing both of those sounds together is kind of cueing back to what made the verses so different from the choruses. We're getting more of that difference here, and then also just a little bit more of sonic fullness, like the stereo information of these synths. It's subtle, and it's not something like no one will ever say like they heard that synth by itself, but what that synth is doing in terms of increasing the width a little bit and just adding a little bit more of the bright, really, really nice sounding highs that the guitars, their highs are super harsh. That stuff is kind of important. So we'll do another A-B. So here's the downbeat of that section without that information. Totally works, right? Here's it with that information. So like I said, not crazy different, but to me, objectively more compelling, even if it's for reasons that you maybe can't put your finger on, saying it's these, you know, 4 elements. It's the shaker, additional guitar, lead synth, and verse synth. Like, that's not the point. These, as far as managing the listener's attention, the point of these tracks is not that you stop and go like, oh, that's the synth we heard from the verse. Like, that doesn't matter at all. The what matters is this kind of unspeakable feeling of like, oh, this feels inevitable, right? Like, we've heard the loud guitars, we've heard the spacey stuff, and now we're hearing them more obviously juxtaposed on top of each other. The track has logically built to this as its loudest and most, you know, compelling, hypothetically, like, widest point. Like, it has the most information in terms of, like, the fuzzy guitars, the really pretty chimey stuff, the sparkly stuff, the melodic vocals. Like, it's all happening at once now. It should feel inevitable, and having these things in there, whether you notice them or not, is playing into that expectation of the sonic world that the track is making. That is the language that the track is speaking, that it's going to use every trick it can to get the most out of each of those sonic elements, and that it's kind of the responsibility of whoever's producing it or mixing it, which is sometimes the same person. In this case, it's me doing everything. But like, it would be a bad choice for the emotional cogency of the song to not do these things, at least in my mind. That's like why these things exist, because it doesn't matter that something technically has changed. Something does technically change. There are technical things changing all the time. You can see there's automation written in, there's layers coming in and out. None of that means anything outside of it helping the song emotionally and sonically achieve what it wants to achieve. I think this would be a good time to stop and talk about that or anything before I run over the 2-hour mark that I was given.
Yeah, I was just going to say real quick, if anybody has any questions or anything, this is a good
Please,
time.
I
since,
love
like Logan
questions.
was saying, we're at the end
I
today.
insist on several questions because I get so excited and I'll just talk for 50 minutes and not hear anything, and it's cognitive dissonance. So yes, I need questions. I demand questions.
What's your process for coming up with the more ambient background synthy stuff that you were just showing
That is
us?
such an excellent question, and it's a variety of things. It depends. So let me say it starts with what needs to be accomplished first, and that's also based on what we're talking about with competition. Sometimes that plays into it, like, is this going to be something at the forefront? So like, for instance, if I was to play verse 2, you would hear a lot of that stuff at the forefront.
Once great as
Right, all that stuff isn't fighting with anything to get out, so those choices are much more important than if I'm just trying to create some sort of breath inside of something else. So basically, it's sort of an idea of what I want to accomplish and how I want to balance it. Let me say, in practicality, it's typically not a thought thing. It's typically like I put one layer in and then I try and figure out what's missing and then I keep adding. So like the first layer I might just go off of instinct of like, cool, I want like a long repeating delay that's really dark and a really washy plate reverb. And then I'm like, cool, that's in there. And then I listen to it, I'm like, oh, okay, this is kind of like missing all of the high range. I'm going to take a guitar and it's only going to be the reverb sound, and it's going to only be the reverb above 1K. And I know that that's totally going to fill out, accomplishing like, oh, it's ambient, but it's also filling up this brightness, and it's not fighting with any of the other frequencies. So like sometimes just what I need to accomplish, or even just the limitations of like, oh, this thing is already happening, you need to fill this space, like you need to fill reverb in only 1K to 20K, like that limitation is actually way more inspiring than like just make any ambient pad and put it anywhere. So a lot of the times what I've already done tells me what I still have room for. So hopefully, you know, like if I tracked these sparkly guitars first, I was like, what don't these have? These are very pleasant, warm mid-range, but they don't have bright stuff. That's much brighter, and it also has, where these are sustaining, these are constantly moving. I'll take these out. So also just a different thing. They're almost like harps. And then that has a lot of high range and almost no warm mids. So all of them together. So I think in my mind, what I want to actually create is like the synth sound that sounds like all of these at the same time, or like the guitar sound, but it's just a bunch of different things. So like none of these by themselves is critical, but if I take any of them out, it's going to sound less compelling. So I'll take one synth out. Right? Less interesting. Or I just take this one. So I think more than just one sound, I'm thinking about the cumulative effect. So I kind of have to go in the order of like I extract this first, it still needs X, Y, Z, and then I find sounds based on that. Or typically that's how it can go from a production standpoint as opposed from a creativity standpoint, both of which are fine. But like if I need to fill out a certain amount of frequencies or not fill out a certain amount of frequencies, that's how I'll think about it.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that makes total sense too, because like listening back to that stuff, it does not sound very like academic or like, do you know what I mean? It doesn't sound like entirely intentional, like
Sure.
100% you planned out the notes and the rhythm and everything. It's sort of like very abstract sounding.
For
So
sure, yeah, and I think it's definitely like I said, it's more of a balance of those things between what I want to exist in, just like even just like what I started with, where my starting point is, than it is about me critically thinking, like drawing out an Excel sheet, like I have these frequency covers, must build part with 300 hertz to 400K, like yeah, 4K. But yeah, like it's typically not that, although that is kind of the impulse behind it. That's kind of like the unconscious brain reasoning for it. Yeah. So that stuff works underneath it, but it's typically not what I'm actively thinking about. The same way, like if you play a solo, you're not like, oh yes, F sharp. You're like, oh, like this note was always going to happen and it felt good because I wanted it. You're not thinking like, you're probably not thinking the note F sharp. Like your probably brain isn't holding up a letter that says F sharp when you play an F sharp. At least mine isn't. So yeah, I think it's kind of the same thing. Like you have a lot of stuff built into it, like of playing your instrument that tells you how to make those choices, but you're not thinking of the information, you're just thinking of the choice, right? I think production is the same way, and it's also why people who like maybe spent 10,000 hours on their instrument but like have spent 10 hours mixing and are frustrated that they're mixing. I'm like, how good are you at bass were you after 10 hours? Like when you only had 10 hours of work put towards it, if you've only spent 100 hours mixing, like imagine yourself at 100 hours into guitar, you were probably still playing like only the low E string, playing Smoke on the Water, which is fine and makes perfect sense. So if that's where you are with mixing, that's your starting point and you're just going to keep going. So I think that, yeah, kind of comes with just, yeah, all this to say, I wasn't really thinking about it, but if I was, that would be my reasoning. If that makes any sense.
makes sense.
That was a great question. Thank you.
Logan, would you suggest using a spectrum tool to kind of confirm what your ears are picking up, like while
Sure.
you're
I mean,
mixing?
that can be a great way to do it. And I will say, like, at first when you are mixing, it should really be, and I kind of alluded to this earlier when I was talking about like how much I hate like mix workshops online that are like, oh man, if you ever boost a vocal more than 3 dB at blah blah blah, like it just doesn't mean anything. Like I would say it's way more important to like understand what your ears like than it is to understand like how it looks or how it meters. So for instance, like if you're like really listening to a vocal and you start boosting up and you're not looking at it and you're like, oh, I boosted 10 decibels of 6K and I really like it, it's like, cool, well, it doesn't matter what that is. What matters is that you heard it in your head and you made it happen and that you liked the result of it. So I think it can be helpful in terms of like informing what your unconscious mind, like we all like doing this because we like listening to music. Like we've all spent our 10,000 hours listening to music like many, many years ago, right? Like you already have all of that common knowledge of just listening to a bunch of albums in your head already. Like there's already so much backdrop of your preferences and what you like. So I would say when you're first approaching it, I think that's more valuable to understand what that stuff is. So maybe more so to be like, what's that thing I really like in vocals where you can kind of hear the breath of each consonant and there's kind of a going on, but it like kind of makes it poke out. I think it's more valuable for you to associate what you already know to be like, oh, that's 10K shelf, cool, is more useful than like going about it the reverse way, if that makes any sense. To like use your own experience to inform how you think about it. So that way when you hear that, you're like, oh yeah, this recording has a lot of 10K on the vocal and I really like that. Is way better than going about it the opposite way. I would say use what you already know and then apply the technical stuff to that, as opposed to like starting at zero with the technical stuff and then trying to build some information around it, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, thank you.
This is more of a comment than anything else, but
That's awesome.
one thing that I really like to do with like my choruses, depending on the genre more or less, but if it's something like it's a heavier song or something like that, I'll put like a synth that's just like super hella distorted, that's like kind of almost got that white noise factor into it, just to add like that little extra bit of like like artificial excitement.
Sure, and what you're talking about is like that exists in every genre where it's just like, what are the slightest ways we can increase the frequency expansion? So like if you listen to like a really poppy song and you're like, oh, there's a shaker on this chorus, like you're probably not hearing you're probably hearing like you're probably just hearing like 10K and above has been raised in the arrangement by adding an instrument that adds that. And this is what I'm saying, like instrumentation and arrangement and production, like they're not divorced from each other. They're like all so each other's thing. Like if you listen to something before there was, you know, like before people credited themselves as producer, like Quincy Jones, he was just an arranger, but like those songs still follow like what we would consider good production in terms of like, oh yeah, the chorus, the low end and the high end opens up, or like 2 bars before this bridge, like the low end totally drops out and then comes back deeper and fuller because he's orchestrating more instruments doing it. Like there's all of those things still work. So like regardless of how it goes, yeah, like hitting a big moment and now having more high frequency information and more low frequency information than the previous section is going to make that section feel bigger and more important. So like it almost doesn't matter how you do it, just knowing what is making that feeling, or just listening to a record and be like, oh wow, like this chorus feels really big, but also these 3 instruments are now, you know, like punching out 5K where it was kind of a hole before is now totally filled. Like that's really useful information regardless of what genre or what or how you go about doing it. Just the fact that like frequency management is, you know, managing, you know, like the listener's interest in the song, taking something away, giving it back bigger is going to have a much bigger difference than just leaving it static and then continuing it static. Yeah. So it's a very important thing to be thinking of and finding creative solutions to it. Yeah. So that sounds like a very good creative solution. Let's do one more question. I know it's almost 8. I think this is way more interesting than the stuff I was talking about because it's only as interesting as it is applicable to you guys.
Come on, somebody's got to have a question.
I believe.
So you used a lot of, I know personally I use a lot of the Isotope plugins that you use as well. Is there any like strong recommendations for plugins like outside of the normal ones you have with DAWs? Any strong recommendations you have for any plugins?
Sure, that's a great question. I will say this. I don't think any of that stuff matters one iota as much as all the other stuff. Because let me say, like, it comes down to your workflow. Like, for instance, I'll give an example. On vocals, I know what I want to accomplish on vocals, so almost exclusively I can count that I'm going to have some kind of de-esser, definitely an SSL channel, and definitely oh, bad example. That's a random intro vocal, chorus vocal, and a CLA 76, which is just a style of compression. So all this to say, like, I have preferences, but they mostly come down to I can really quickly dial in a bunch of sounds that I like in addition to filters, in addition to a gate, in addition to a compressor. I can do that all in one plugin that I'm almost always going to use on almost every vocal. So this is not to say like none of this stuff would not be accomplishable by anything else. It's just I find this particular tool more efficient because I can do a lot of things in one fell swoop. I'm not bouncing between different plugins to get just essentially one motion of like carving the vocal sound, mild compression, gating as needed. That's more for transient information stuff, metering, all that together. So I think it is important to find what works for you as far as workflow, but I will say, like, if I know what I want out of mix, I could easily do that with entirely stock plugins. It might just take me a little bit longer because of the workflow thing. There's very few of these plugins, but some of them, like for instance, if you like this style of compression, if you like like a FET style of compression, then having something that is based on an 1176 or like a Uri Empirical Labs distressor or something like that, then you need something like this. But if you don't have that preference already, like, it's silly for me to say, like, this is the style of compression I like the most, so you should also like this style of compression the most and get this tool that I find useful. I think this is the way I would look about it. When you're evaluating what to spend your money on, especially because it is like, that is a really realistic question, and as someone who is also obsessed with music gear, like, I have my own obsessions as far as things go. It's typically not all plugins, but plugins are part of it. Like, the thing that I think is the most critical, if you're like, I want this to serve a purpose, is to really look critically about, like, what is your workflow and all these things, what is the weakest link, and what has the most direct correlation to doing that. So it's like, I wish I could do this thing and I can't, is a way different thing than, like, I've heard that this famous producer uses this $200 compressor, so I guess I need to use it too. Like, that doesn't mean anything. Like, I think that's really silly, actually. Like, it should be based about, like, what about your process can you improve, and that you've done everything you can with everything you have, and you're being actually limited by the stuff you have. Because I would say 90% of the things I would do to a mix, I could do with any stock plugin. I just have certain individual preferences for the things I've been exposed to or the things that I like. Is not to say that I couldn't do those things. I would just do them slightly differently or slightly less efficiently. So I think the answer is figuring out what for you is the most critical, and really trusting your ears to be like, okay, I've listened to these 7 different people talk about these 7 different compressors, and here are like the workflow things I find really useful, and here are the ones that I think sound the best, and this one's the same one, so I guess that's the one I should get. So all of this to say, I have things that I really like. There are people who would use the same things and hate everything that I like about them. That would be their least favorite things. So I have no recommendations besides like figure out what works for you and what your weakest link is. But that being said, I think the SSL channel is great for what I said. Like quick filters. This EQ also has more of a sound than like your 7-band will have. Like it's based on a unit that had, you know, like it had like transistors and capacitors, and it has impedance, and it has like some amount of saturation and stuff going on it. So like this one is just become a go-to tool, but it's become a go-to tool because I bought it and I was like, I want to use this all the time because I bought it, and I built a workflow around it, not the other way around. It wasn't so much like, oh, like I want to go about it this way and I can't. It was like, I have this tool and I'm going to use it. So just figure out what will make you more efficient or more musical. But that being said, this SSL channel I use every session on every track. But I also think that, like I said, there's so many things inside of Pro Tools. Like it's silly for someone to like buy, for instance, Decapitator is a really popular saturation distortion plugin. Like if you haven't spent a couple hours seeing what Lo-Fi, which is the free one, can do, I use Lo-Fi in every single mix. Like it's an amazing plugin and it's free. Like so if you haven't spent 5 hours with Lo-Fi, it's silly for me to be like, oh, you should really buy Decapitator. Like no, you should spend 5 hours with the thing you have that's free. So like know your tools and know where those tools stop being useful or where you start needing to do things that those tools don't provide. Like there's some things like what does Jacob Collier use all the time? He's got like the LFO tool, I think is what it's called, and it has a very specific thing of like basically you can do sidechain compression without needing something triggering the compression. You can just sort of like write over a new ADSR, and I'm like, oh, that's really cool. There's not an equivalent of something that can do that I have. So if I want to do that thing in that specific way, I understand that there is, you know, a $50 thing I can get that can do that if I think it's worth $50, which I don't really. But yeah, so that's my weird, backwards, not actual answer to that very straightforward, reasonable question.
Yeah, I remember when Isotope was actually giving away the Ozone 9 element for free, and I was just like, I downloaded it, and I love that thing now.
Yeah, and by virtue of having it, I'm sure you're finding a lot of things inside of it that you're like, this is going to become a thing that I always do, or like this is going to be a go-to when I want this sound. So yeah, and all of that to say, you can do that with any plugin you either already have or don't have. So I think that's where the preference thing is just like, tools are tools, and we should, you know, respect them for what they can do, but not, you know, I think especially when it comes to like vintage or outboard stuff, there's a lot of people who are like really obsessed with like, the thing is the reason, like owning a piece of gear, like it's gonna sit there and make music for you. Like it's not. It doesn't matter. Like it's a tool that you can use for whatever you want, but like it has no inherent value on its own. And that's how I feel about kind of all of any pro audio anything, honestly. Which is why I have a really unsatisfying answer to that very good question. Cool. This was fun. If Grant, if anybody has any remaining questions, they can feel free to hit me up on my work email. But hopefully, and hopefully maybe upon rewatch, I've no idea how cogent or interesting this was. Like I said, I can't really gauge. but hopefully, at least upon rewatch or like some time to sink in, this is way more broad stroke stuff that I wanted to touch on than like, hey, you're mixing a vocal, do it like this. Like, I don't think there is a right way to mix a vocal. I don't think there's a correct bass sound. I'm way more interested and way more compelled by like the reasons why we want things to sound certain ways, or like the conceptual approach of like, we want a certain end product and we need to make technical decisions to create something that is like the thing we're imagining that doesn't exist yet. I find that way more interesting than like, you should mix a vocal like this, because it's like, you should mix a vocal like this in this type of song in this context if you're me. Like, yeah, I don't think that stuff is nearly as transportable as the more conceptual, broady, heady stuff, which I assume is like a lot harder to latch onto, as opposed to like mix tricks and hacks, which I find, like I've mentioned, is some of my least favorite type of like pro audio content, is that type of stuff. I think it's very narrow minded. So apologies if anybody came here looking for that stuff and I totally did not deliver. Hopefully the conceptual stuff, at least, you know, over time, is something that you're thinking about, something I think about a lot. So I think it's kind of the make or break thing in terms of what makes a production work or not. It is technical stuff, but the reasons behind the technical stuff that prompt that, all that stuff, is way more important than the things themselves.
Cool.